Welcome to a conversation with Finance Ministries on fiscal programs. The event has simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. Please use the word icon at the bottom of the Zoom menu and choose the language of your preference. Bienvenidos a la conversación con ministros de Finanzas de América Latina y el Caribe. El evento cuenta con interpretación simultánea en inglés y en español. En el icono de mundo en la parte inferior del menú de Zoom podrá seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia. We are pleased to have the IDB Chief Economist, Eric Parrado, as the moderator. Mr. Parrado, the microphone is yours.
Muchas gracias y bienvenidos a la reunión 5.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the 57th meeting of the Network of Central Banks and Finance Ministries of the Inter-American Development Bank. We have as Chief Economist here at the IDB, it's an honor to be chairing this panel where we have ministers from the region. So first of all, I wanted to welcome you to this conversation with ministers of finance. We have Mr. Christopher Coye from Belize, Mr. José Vicente from the Dominican Republic, Pablo Arosemena, who is the Minister of Economy and Finance in Ecuador, Rixi Moncada, Ministry of Finance of Honduras. So welcome. We're very excited about having you with us, and especially because we're going to be examining the challenges faced by the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of public finance. And of course, you're in charge of these fiscal issues in supporting your countries. So to start with our agenda, we have given you 5 minutes of time for you to tell us how you have been implementing your fiscal programs, the challenges that you face in your countries. So each of you will have 5 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer period, and there we will try to get into the details of different issues that you will have raised in your introductory remarks. So to make efficient use of time, I'm going to thank everyone here in the room. And also we know that other people are connected over social media. But I wanted to remind you that you can speak either English or Spanish. We do have simultaneous interpretation, so we're going to begin with Minister Christopher Coye, who will be commenting on fiscal reform in Belize. Please go ahead.
Gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to share Belize's experience in these times of multiple concurrent external economic shocks. Just a couple of years ago, Belize was in deep crisis. The economy contracted by over 13%, leading to an unemployment rate nearing 30% and poverty rate estimates exceeding 50%. The government suffered a revenue shortfall of around 30% while simultaneously ramping up pandemic-related expenditures, translating to an overall deficit of 11% of GDP. Fueling these extraordinary expenditures with debt, while already in debt distress, Belize's debt to GDP soared to an unsustainable 133%. All of this transpired in the context of Belize as one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, with average annual losses due to extreme climate events hovering around 4% of GDP. Facing these enormous challenges, what is a government to do? A popular phrase coined by the author Stephen Coye comes to mind. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. In other words, stay focused on the most important goals in order to achieve them. In our case, our most important goal is to achieve long-term sustainable human development of our people. We feel that that goal is achievable through the path towards economic independence by climate-smart, efficient resource utilization, export development, and import substitution. To progress in that direction, however, we had to take immediate action to overcome those challenges while maintaining our focus on our development goals. This required a difficult but necessary exercise in fiscal discipline and political will. We had to address the unaffordable fiscal expenditure levels in the immediate term. This meant cutting public sector wages by 10%, slashing goods and services expenditures, reprioritizing capital expenditures to those with the lowest cost of capital, particularly those that contain concessionary financing resources. And of course, renegotiating our debt burden. Through the Belize bond transaction, Belize was able to successfully secure a 45% discount of its external commercial debt, immediately reducing its overall debt by 12%. Belize also secured much-needed cash flow from Taiwan by procuring a moratorium on principal debt repayments, while reaching an agreement with Venezuela for a 60% discount on Belize's Petrocaribe debt. We also took steps to reduce the cost of domestic debt. On the revenue side, Belize chose not to increase taxes, but rather to broaden the tax base and increase compliance. We also moved to strategically reopen and support our key economic sectors, namely tourism and agriculture, while encouraging much-needed economic diversification and investment, in particular in the areas of business process outsourcing and small business development. The results of these efforts were dramatic. Belize grew over 15% in 2021 and over 10% in 2022. The economy diversified as the BPO sector now forms a significant component of our economy in terms of income, foreign exchange, and employment generation. Foreign reserves are at all-time highs, with foreign direct investment at its highest in over a decade. Belize's debt-to-GDP ratio has fallen in just 2 years from 133% to 64% as at the end of last year. Our fiscal position has so improved that Belize was able to quickly recover from the substantial damage and loss caused by Hurricane Lisa in November of last year, equivalent to almost 5% of GDP, with no debt raise and very little external grant assistance. Most importantly, focusing in on human development. Even with a minimum wage increase of 50%, Belize's unemployment rate is now at an all-time low of 5%, while the multidimensional poverty index indicates that the poverty rate is now under 36%. Looking forward, Belize and its public finances are in an improved position to support public investment towards human development, particularly in areas of education, health, citizen security, physical and digital infrastructure, and energy, while fostering and encouraging private investment and public-private partnerships in a broadening set of economic sectors. Climate resiliency building, however, remains a tall order, for which Belize is itself not in a position to accomplish. To achieve its NDC targets, Belize needs upwards of 70% of GDP. This is where the global financial architecture needs to evolve to provide meaningful, proactive, preventative support, not reactive, disaster contingent debt financing, especially noting that we, the small, vulnerable states, played no role in accelerating climate change and its disastrous effects. That support must come by way of grants and highly concessional financing, as well as subsidized credit enhancements to make our debt investment grade. Many challenges still remain and lie ahead. Inflation, food security concerns, climate change, to name a few. But so long as we keep the main thing as the main thing, we are confident that with the support of our development partners, particularly for climate resiliency building, our development goals are achievable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those comments. I think it's very important to have and extract some good lessons from the Belizean case. So probably in the Q&A session, we can talk a little bit about that. Ministro José Vicente.
Minister José Vicente, you have 5 minutes. You can call me Hochi. The only person who calls me José is my mother, and that's when she's mad at me. Right. Needless to say that the economic situation we've had to grapple with over the past 2 or 3 years has been tough, and what we have done, what our government has done, is quite similar to what we've heard about a chess game. What you need to do to win, you need to be ready. You need to have a good first move. You need to have a strategy, and you need to know how to play the game and be tactical. Like Minister Coye, I too believe that human development should be a part of any government strategy. That should be the long-term objective. And we, fortunately or unfortunately, on our side, what our government has had to do over the past 3 crises we've had to deal with has been to tactically adjust certain factors so that we can deal with the obstacles brought by these crises without sacrificing human development, given its importance for economic development. So I would say that as part of those tactical moves, we have focused on 3 major areas. One is protecting the most vulnerable sectors. And this was done in the COVID context as well as in the post-COVID stage when we had to deal with inflation and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So all of this has taken up public sector resources. It's put stress on the public finances of our government, like all others, and we decided to leverage the private sector and to bring it to bear. And I will explain this later. And thirdly, in the midst of all of this, we have tried to keep macroeconomic stability and to manage our fiscal accounts prudently. When it comes to the most vulnerable sectors, our administration from the very beginning has done a series of things. Perhaps the most important was to double subsidies, the amount that was earmarked to social assistance programs, and we also doubled the number of beneficiaries. Because this all happened with COVID, when people lost their jobs, when they needed additional support. So in terms of leveraging the private sector, what we've done is to enhance work with PPPs. We have an iconic project which is going to be developing a new tourism hub in the countries, Pedernales, which is one of the poorest and most depressed areas in the country. And the way to bring development and progress to that area is by stepping up economic activity. Governments can offer social assistance, but the only thing that is lasting over time is jobs. There's constraints as to what public sector can do. There's fiscal constraints. There's other complexities. And what we're doing through that project, which is a PPP, is ensuring that there are permanent jobs in one of the poorest areas in the country. So that is a way to develop the area. And lastly, against this whole backdrop, we've looked for ways to address fiscal accounts prudently. The temptation and also the need are there. And there's a saying in Spanish, which is literally save bread for May and flour for April. So we started working in April, laying the foundation. When it came to debt management, we wanted to alleviate the financing needs for future years. Given the uncertainty, we did not know what would happen with financial markets, and we did not want to be caught with one more concern. So over the past 3 years, we've had 4 liability management operations which have extended the maturities on our debt, lowering financial cost of that debt and alleviating the cash flow pressure during those years in particular. Because then we had issues like inflation, Russia's war in Ukraine. So the work we did in April paid off in May, according to the saying. So that, I would say, in general terms, is what we have been able to do over the past 3 years. Thank you, Minister Rixi Vicente, for your comments and especially for your message regarding the need for prudence. There are social pressures and we have to find a way to meet those needs. And perhaps we can later discuss the best way to provide that support, whether it's by targeting or general relief measures. I would invite Minister Pablo Arosemena from Ecuador to take the floor. In 1850, a French economist said that the state is the fiction through which everybody wants to live off of everybody else. And that is what I've had to do as Minister of Finance. People want me to reduce subsidy, or increase subsidies, but decrease taxes. Now we are an oil-producing country, even though our revenues are dropped. But one of our non-traditional exports is shrimp. It's a new industry. Our country may be the largest exporter of shrimp in the world. We have unicorn companies living off of that. But then the fuel they use for the engines that are pumping water in the shrimp tanks inland use subsidized fuel. We did something nobody had dared to do. This was a few months ago with the leadership of our President Lasso, and it was to target subsidies to the shrimp industry. They sell $7 billion per year, but this generated pushback. There was a lot of resistance, but we were able to pull it off, and this enabled us to save more than $200 million, eliminating the subsidy for those who have more than 30 hectares. 30 hectares is a small piece of land, and other than that, subsidies have been opened up. The larger producers are coming to us, and they are asking us to adjust our measures to prevent any type of illegal activities, such as smuggling. So we are combining social and fiscal measures. Before President Lasso came on, the fiscal deficit was minus 7.7% of GDP in dollars, more than $8.8 billion of resources we did not have. And this were capital accounts and amounts outstanding. Currently, we've reduced the fiscal deficit considerably. Last year, we ended at minus 1.7, from 7.7 to minus 1. The reserves at the central bank before President Lasso were very low. Now they are at $8.2 billion, the highest level on record since our economy was dollarized 20 years ago. Last year, for the first time, we successfully agreed on a program with the IMF, something we had not been able to do for 20 years. Our former minister, Mr. Gallardo, who's here, had achieved that in 2001 or 2. Since then, Ecuador had had many programs but never had one with the IMF, and we did do that in December of last year. Second lowest inflation in the region, 9th lowest in the world. So despite these positive figures, we have monumental challenges. And I think that the role of the Ministry of the Economy and Finance and of the government is not just technical and political. We need to be pedagogical. We need to explain to people why we do what we do and why we don't do what we don't do. Because people ask us, what's the point of reducing the fiscal deficit if we still have unmet basic needs? So that's where the challenge lies. And our administration has reduced the deficit, creating space to double our social coverage for the most vulnerable groups. Before, 3 out of 10 families received monthly monetary transfer. Now it's 8 out of 10. So before, we had number of people receiving special assistance, and now that number has increased significantly. So there's 1 million people who were already poor who were not receiving assistance and are now receiving assistance because they have been prioritized. So I think that the challenge lies in teaching and explaining. It is an ongoing challenge, something we had not done successfully before, which means explaining what we do. There's a lot of social angst, and people have needs that cannot wait. 3 weeks ago in Panama, Eric, there were a number of things in your presentation that struck me, one in particular. You analyzed Latin American countries and OECD countries. You compared them, and you showed the difference in the Gini coefficient, inequality pre and post taxation and monetary transfers. We could see that in developed countries, when you add taxes and monetary transfers, that helps to shrink inequality, but not so in the region. So we are not allotting resources in a way that addresses that problem. So I don't have the answer, but the question is, how can we ensure that we have more efficient public spending, given that resources are scarce, and what people are demanding, and this takes us back to 100 years, is how can you take money from Peter and give it to Paul, and at the same time make it so that they both have more money. So we're trying to maintain a fiscal deficit and at the same time step up social measures and make sure that people understand the values that we are promoting. Thank you very much. One thing that I think is important is communication. I think we've made some progress on the monetary policy side, but we need to make a bigger effort to explain taxes and subsidies. So what you're doing in that connection is very important. The other point is it's very difficult to establish subsidies. It's harder to roll them back. So I think that is another important thing to consider, given the scarcity of resources and the many crises we have had to deal with in recent years. Now, Minister Moncada, I would invite you to share your opinion with us. Good afternoon. I'm sorry, her volume is very low. The interpreters cannot hear her. I'm sorry, her microphone is extremely low. The interpreters cannot hear the speaker. We'll resume as soon as possible.
Nos esperan los problemas que están caracterizando a toda la región y que venimos discutiendo desde hace décadas en todas las sociedades. Que si subsidio, que si no subsidio, que si asistencia, que si no asistencia. Lo cierto es que donde hay alguien que gana, siempre hay un grupo que pierde. ¿Quién es ese grupo que pierde? Nosotros estimamos desde un punto de vista del orden de los estados, que está perdiendo el sistema y el orden democrático, porque la gente cree en la democracia y sigue yendo, aunque en menor porcentaje, a las urnas para elegir sus autoridades, pero no está conforme con ella, porque le están exigiendo que vaya cada 4, cada 5, cada 6 años, qué sé yo, a las elecciones a depositar su voto bajo el sistema de partidos políticos como base sustentable del orden democrático, pero le pedimos que vaya y que deposite el voto bajo un programa X o Y, pero luego ese programa no llega a solucionarle el problema. Y seguimos entonces debatiendo sobre si subsidio o no subsidio, si focalizamos o no focalizamos, pero hay segmentos dentro de la sociedad que no tienen la tragedia que enfrentamos los estados a través de los ministros de finanzas. Hay sectores que siempre son frondosos, que siempre son gananciosos, y eso obviamente evidencia que algo está mal. Yo no quiero hablar de cifras esta tarde, quiero compartir con ustedes lo que yo llamo en mi país un periodo especial. Nosotros llevamos 15 meses de gobierno. Preside nuestro gobierno la primera mujer presidenta, es la única mujer, creo, en la región. Y en estos 15 meses de este periodo especial, habiendo recibido el país después de 13 años de gobierno post-golpe de Estado, con el presidente de 2 periodos prisionero en este país por liderar una red de narcotráfico y con cientos de casos de corrupción público-privada en proceso de investigación, en 15 meses. La decisión y el desafío fundamental de nuestra presidenta, desde todas las políticas del Estado, pero fundamentalmente desde la Secretaría de Finanzas, el combate a la corrupción público-privada. Y el combate a la corrupción público-privada que heredamos comienza por 2 reformas fundamentales. Extinguir un sistema de fideicomisos que hizo que todos los fondos prácticamente públicos estuvieran en 70 cajas regadas en los 17 bancos que operan en el sistema financiero. Y que entonces la Secretaría de Finanzas evidenciara una total debilidad en... ¿Qué pasa? Es especial también el periodo acá.
Ahora sí.
3 micrófonos.
Okay, that's mic number 3. This is a special time as well. So the Secretary of Finance, once we received instructions from the government, had to go, or we had to deal with an empty treasury. So the first reform was to eliminate trust funds and bring resources back into the treasury, the national treasury. The second, which was a structural reform, which had a significant impact, and I have 40 seconds left, so this is just a beginning, and I hope to get questions so that I can elaborate. So, as I was saying, the second impactful reform was the reform of the energy sector, the Energy Bill of Law, which declared energy to be as a right, as an economic and social right. That statement and the enactment of that new energy bill has been essential in a context where there are 2 problems that account for the region's poverty. One is food security, and the other is the cost and the uncertain supply of energy. The third major reform, in my last second, is currently being discussed, and it's the law on tax justice, which is the law against tax corruption. And this is something we need in order to bring our public finances in order. Thank you, Minister. A round of applause, please. I would ask for a round of applause for all ministers because you all were right on time in your use of the 5 minutes you had been given. So it's important for us to have that kind of order in the region. The challenges are many and are huge. So I'd like to start with one general question. It's something that most of you mentioned, and it's that on the one hand, we have to maintain macroeconomic stability. We are in a world that is full of turbulence and shocks, and every first quarter since 2020, we are hit with a shock. First the pandemic, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now we have the banking sector's uncertainty in developed countries, which clearly has an impact on us. So on the one hand, we have macroeconomic stability. On the other hand, we have the social front. How do we strike that balance? What are you seeing in your countries? What are you doing in this connection? So, Minister, let's start with you. Let me go over my notes. How do we maintain stability given the country's reaction? In 2019, when we had the coup d'etat, our public debt was about $3 billion. Last year, on the 27th of January, we had a recorded debt for the central administration of $20 billion, including the energy sector. So the heaviest burden, the most critical situation is our debt. Not so much debt vis-a-vis international or multilateral organizations, but rather our domestic debt. It means that 40% of our tax collections go directly to our debt payment. On the other hand, that annual debt level and those debt obligations we have to pay and will continue to pay fully as we did last year, despite the crisis and all the internal and external difficulties. That same amount, those same obligations are equivalent to the fiscal and tax exemptions given by the government in order to attract investment, especially foreign investment. So how do we balance this? There's a gap. On the collection side, 40% of taxes collected are used to pay off our debt, but our debt forgiveness or debt exemptions are equivalent to the debt we are paying every year. So we have to find a way to address the needs of the 6.3 million people who, out of the 9 million living in our country, are living in extreme poverty. There's no policies, no subsidies that can cover all these people effectively. Despite a good census, despite targeting, human beings want jobs. They don't want handouts. It's not enough for us to provide them with 1,200 or 1,300 lempiras per month so that they can buy food supplies. That is not enough. That is why we have social unrest. That is why we have social and political violence. I think it's something we're all experiencing. What are we doing? We are starting on the planning side. In Honduras, the planning ministries were eliminated. The planning offices had been eliminated. So we began with planning. Secondly, under planning is setting priorities, developing social programs that are geared to the most vulnerable sectors, but that in itself is not enough. Structural reforms have a midterm horizon, but now in the present we have to be very disciplined on the fiscal front. We have to find ways to increase the resources we collect so that we can meet our debt obligations. It's not an easy situation, but we believe that we need to continue to build avenues that will enable us to advance social projects that benefit our people. Because it's true, they have unmet needs. The system did not work, and we need to fill those gaps, at least temporarily. Well, we need to go from having inclusive growth as a slogan. We need to make it a reality. So using 40% of revenue for debt service is high. On average, the debt service for Latin America and the Caribbean for the last 3 years should be 12%. We think that's the number, but it's still high, with debt to GDP ratios the order of 75% for the entire region. But if we compare that with developed countries, which have much higher debt to GDP ratios, debt service for those countries is only 5% of that amount. So if we could only free up those resources and use them for social programs or for infrastructure and productive investments, it would be something that would be very beneficial for our countries. Same question for Minister Arosemena. regarding how you balance social pressure and the demand for quality social services together with macroeconomic stability. How do you do it? Well, the challenge is how having a fiscal balance or balanced public finances, how you can maintain that without neglecting social issues. It's easy to focus on social issues, neglecting fiscal balance. And so neither one works. The challenge is in addressing both. So when we prepared the budget for this year, and we started in September, October last year, it went to the National Assembly or a Congress, we said it's the first time in years where we've had a budget which has a lower fiscal deficit and steps up social investment. So how can you do that? How is that possible? To lower the social deficit, we had to lower spending. How? We renegotiated our debt with China, which was sizable, was a legacy of previous administrations. We extended the maturities of our loans with the China Development Bank and with the Exim Bank. And then there's an added complication for Ecuador is that those payments were guaranteed with oil barrels in a way that was very complicated, to say the least. It was a very obscure formula. By extending maturities, the payments were reduced. So let's say that 100% of the barrels given as guarantee, of those 50% were freed and are now being sold at market prices. So all of this in cash flow is $1.4 billion for the Republic of Ecuador, having renegotiated its debt with China. And that, as I said before, enabled us to cut subsidies with savings of about $200 million. So that's 1.6. And that afforded us with room to say, how can we increase social investment? So this is in sectors and comprehensively, investing in education, jobs. The Ministry of Inclusion has $1.4 billion, in 1.3 of which go to the people in transfers every month. So reducing the deficit made it possible for us to increase social investment. What this means, well, do people appreciate this? That is yet another channel. That's where communication comes in, educating people. Just doing it is not enough. We've only been talking about macroeconomics, and people on the street say, I want to hear about microeconomics. How am I able to buy food? How can I fill up my fridge? How can I have food in my cabinets? How can ministers of the economy approach public policy in that way, understanding that what we're doing at the macro level is to help people at the micro level? So since last year, we've been trying to take the pulse of microeconomy, what our business people look at, which is sales. Last year, we had $225 billion in sales. This is not GDP. This is sales numbers, total billing at all levels, $225 billion adjusted for inflation and adjusted for population. This is the highest level of sales, the record level in our history. That was last year. We had 18 days in which things were paralyzed, and it was a year that was fraught with insecurity. Despite that, we had record level sales. The economy is divided in 20 sectors, and I could list them all. How many of these sectors grew? Was it only the shrimp industry or the oil industry? 20 of the 20 sectors grew in sales. Their sales numbers increased compared to previous years. But that still means that there's a challenge, how to communicate this in a very simple way so that people can understand it. Because people come back and say, okay, but we don't get it. We don't feel it. So we need to be able to make this clear. And I'll end with one last thing. At the Central Bank of Ecuador, there's a survey of 1,000 countries, micro, small, medium-sized, and large. We asked them, do you think you're going to increase your sales next week, or next month? Are you going to be more profitable? Despite the political instability and all the problems we have in the world, the region, and Ecuador, the confidence index for the business world is at its highest point in our history. So these are the contrasts we are experiencing. You put your economic house in order, the economy starts to recover, but how do we make people feel that, perceive that? It's not just Ecuador. In the U.S., but before the problem with the banking sector in recent months, the sentiment of U.S. consumers was at its worst level. This was a few months ago, and now it's even worse. It was worse than in March of 2020. In March of 2020, the future was bleak for the entire world. So how is it possible for a booming economy to have such a negative sentiment, a negative outlook? The world has changed since COVID. Now people want things immediately. The demands are pressing. We need to find a way to make sure that all the efforts we're deploying are perceived and appreciated by the people. Because unless that happens, it's like having barbarians at the gate, people who want to come in and crush democracy. And we know what happened with political cycles.
So right now, you have a responsible government in place. I'm talking about Ecuador. And this has nothing to do with the current administration. It has to do with what the market is saying. So I'm afraid of, in the future, there being an irresponsible government. But people will say, well, the country risk is high, so macroeconomics really don't matter. But if you have responsible people in place, they put the economy in order, then irresponsible come in and wreck it. So how can we do what needs to be done, but we need to be able to get the message out so that people understand the value of what is being done. Plus, societies have become more efficient, and because of the political confrontations, that stands in the way. And then what would you say about this issue? I share many of the ideas, the arguments that were outlined by Pablo, and I think that you do have to realize that we are at a very special juncture. There are some things that have to be addressed, other things that have to be put off until later. This choice between social protection, subsidies, and at the same time following fiscal prudence, I'm not saying that we have to neglect fiscal prudence. It shouldn't be set aside. What I am saying is that right now, the whole matter of fiscal prudence has fallen slightly below the need to deal with fiscal needs. And I hope that no one in my country is listening, but we as ministers of finance do have to have that sensitivity. We need to realize that this is not a good time for tremendous fiscal consolidation. The time will come to do fiscal consolidation. We have to work on that. The Dominican Republic has gotten out good messages. We have taken steps in terms of fiscal consolidation, but the perfect is the enemy of things that are practical. So to force through a fiscal consolidation, going beyond what is prudent socially, will turn against the consolidation itself. And right now is the time to keep our ear to the ground. We need to understand what the needs are. The needs are vast. We have to realize that we cannot do everything. And we, in that context, have implemented a series of subsidies. Some of the subsidies are not all that costly economically, but they do have a major impact. Just as an example, this is something that has been quite successful. We implemented a subsidy for fertilizers. It's not a large subsidy, but the impact that that subsidy has had helping protect agricultural production, where the agricultural sector employs about 8% of our economically active population in Dominican Republic, has allowed us to keep fertilizer prices at the same level they were at when the urea was at $550 per ton. Now, that price went up to $1,000 per ton. And so the subsidy didn't cost all that much, but it did provide reassurance to the agricultural sector and to farm production. And it also favored the campesinos. So this is one way of dealing with the storm that we face, and it allows us to analyze different measures as we try to assure success. The whole idea of focusing subsidies is something that sometimes becomes quite theoretical, didactic, and sometimes to think, okay, that subsidy could be more focused. True, but how long will it take me to focus that subsidy? So perhaps I'll have a great targeting exercise, a focus exercise, but it may take me 6 months to do that because I'm not sure what the target population should be, or because I need control measures to fight corruption. But sometimes we just have to be practical. We may not be perfect, but right now, at this juncture, I think that we have to focus on doing things that are practical, not so much theoretical, academic. Now, we, as ministers, have to make certain that the assistance will actually reach the people at this point when they really need our support. Thank you. That's right. And we have to also talk about lessons for the future, because this will not be the last crisis. So what you're saying is very important. We need to take measures in these volatile times. Something else that was mentioned in the IDB's publication on debt had to do with fiscal consolidation. Everyone understands that the fiscal effort that resulted from the pandemic had to be done. And that is why the fiscal deficits were higher. There was greater indebtedness, but now we need a plan for the future. And that means that we have to be prudent. But of course, we have to make certain that we're not having major social impacts. So a question for you.
It's an macro equilibrium. How do you deal with that in Belize?
A few comments. I would start off with our Prime Minister's comments in relation to social protection. He keeps it simple, that the best social protection that a government can offer is a job, getting our people to work. I think fellow ministers here have spoken a lot about many of these considerations, looking out for those most vulnerable, those most in need. And Belize faced that same situation, particularly coming out of the pandemic. A large percentage of the population was without jobs. But at the same time, we already had a heightened level of poverty. That said, the approach that we took, given our tough financial position that we found ourselves in, was to engage the private sector. How do we activate commercial activity at the earliest possibility, and aggressively doing so? Mobilizing money, mobilizing the flow of capital means income for those that receive that capital, and there's obviously that multiplier effect. My colleagues that are elected officials highlight to me more recently, they have, in Belize we have what you call clinics. Once a week, typically once a week, the politician would have a clinic in the sense of having a day where they meet their constituents. And in those early days of this administration, what they would find is the lines of people coming for assistance, handouts, support for electricity bills, etc., whatever it may be. But as we've come through this process where the economy has grown, jobs are available as you may want, that line has shrunken. You don't have as many people showing up for those clinics because people have jobs. They don't need a handout to put food on the table. They themselves are generating their own income to put the food on the table for their families. So that gets back to how do we generate employment? How do we create the environment to generate employment? And for us, it's been looking at what areas does Belize, taking that, yes, that macro, but also how it informs on the micro. In what areas do Belize have those comparative advantages? And certainly, yes, Belize has been not diversified in its economy, in that it has focused heavily on tourism and agriculture. And yes, we continue to focus on enhancing those sectors, but at the same time, we have to look at how we broaden and diversify. And that's where, for us, seeing the comparative advantage in business process outsourcing, not necessarily in terms of having that idea for our own, but appreciating that latent demand and enabling that demand to be to proliferate into becoming a real economic sector for our economy. I think that's where we focused in on to encourage, to provide incentives for, and what that has done is start from roughly zero in terms of employment to now where it represents between 5 and 7% of our workforce in a matter of 2 years. It also generates substantial foreign exchange, and being a currency pegged jurisdiction, our currency is pegged to the US dollar, being able to generate foreign exchange, additional foreign exchange, that certainly supports our goal to economic independence, but also enables us to be able to provide support to those most in need. Finding that balance for us is seeking to appreciate the public sentiment and gauging that public sentiment. You will never make everybody happy, but you have to make them happy enough. And so when we look at the challenges of the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruption, and inflation, etc., we have to gauge that public sentiment. We have gone through the process of introducing subsidies. We have subsidies in place. From a pragmatic standpoint, yes, the economists will tell you it's better to have targeted subsidies. But from a basis of pragmatism, that's not possible if we are to move swiftly and to have an immediate impact. So we have introduced a fuel price stabilization program. We have it in place for over a year now since the war in Ukraine started and the prices skyrocketed. That has helped to moderate, to mute the level of inflation, so that inflation in Belize is among the lowest in the region. It's in between 6 and 6.5% for last year. And relying on some of the analysis that we requested of the IMF, that effort in terms of fuel price stabilization, according to the IMF, has been one of the key factors in helping to moderate inflation in Belize. But we have other subsidies. We have introduced on a temporary basis subsidies for bread, as well as transportation subsidies. Those have since expired, and yes, there's a challenge to continue them, but we have taken the position that we need not continue those, but we have maintained our fuel subsidies. So that's where that balance is, and gauging that public sentiment. It's no exact science, but at the same time, it's important that we seek to strike that balance in fiscal prudence, but at the same time, looking at how we enhance and support human development through employment and through targeted approaches, preferably temporary.
Thank you, Minister. And I really like this idea that the best social protection is a job. Very, very true. Because you mentioned that Belize has recovered strongly from the pandemic with really high rate of growth in 2021 and 2022, and you also improved the fiscal situation. So tell us, what are the secrets behind this remarkable performance?
I think reflecting on our experience, I believe that certainly maintaining fiscal discipline and having the political will to make those tough decisions played an important role. It played an important role for building credibility with the international community. Belize had always been seen, well, not always, but for the past decade or prior decade, have been seen as a serial defaulter. And when it became imperative that we restructure, renegotiate our debt, who would believe us that we would do what we say we will do if we never did what we were doing or promised to do before? So we had to build credibility, and that meant making tough decisions, but also having the discipline to stick by those decisions. Perhaps by happenstance, we had political capital. Not many governments might be in that similar position, but we were a new government with a landslide majority. We had political capital that we could invest. So when we made those tough decisions that meant cutting public sector wages, for example, we had to go through months-long strikes, but we maintained our position and stood by those decisions. Rather than retrenching people in a time where unemployment was high, we felt that we could share the sacrifice, or that our public officers could share that sacrifice. Those were decisions that impacted on expenditure containment, but it also brought along with it renewed credibility in the international community and in our own economy. And with those decisions, the results that came about from those decisions reinforce the approach that we took domestically, so that we domestically built our own level of credibility as well for those for that disciplined approach. So I think certainly on the fiscal side, having that fiscal discipline and maintaining that political will is an important factor. Of course, alongside that would be certain strategic policy decision making, reopening the economy aggressively, encouraging investment, not just foreign investment, but investment in general, supporting MSMEs, which represent roughly 90% of our business community, were all decisions that we took that have had a positive impact on our economy and our performance.
Thank you very much, Minister. Ahora, Ministra.
Minister Moncada, you were talking about the tax justice law, and I would like to hear about the details. because I understand this is a better distribution of the tax burden in the country. So could you help us understand what the law is all about? And also in terms of the dialogue, the policy dialogue? That's a question that I have been answering since yesterday. So who asked the question? In terms of the discussion, the debate on the tax justice law, as I said, I call it the law against tax corruption, more than tax justice. But the question basically has to do with the socialization process, which is not easy. It's not easy to change in our countries, right? No, it's a very complicated process. But especially because this tax justice law, that's the name, puts an end to a tradition where tax exemptions have been given for something like 70 years. So we went from being a banana republic of turning over all of our land, turning over all of those benefits back then to be able to import or to produce or to export bananas. And then we became a mining republic. So much so, that is the way that our capital city, Tegucigalpa, was built. It's always said that the surrounding areas of Tegucigalpa are because of the working of the mines. And then we went to fiscal exemptions through a system called Solrit, and also then we moved into providing cheap labor and offering tax-free status, and that is the way that we have been competing. So Honduras, during the last 70 years, has been working with sectors that were clearly identified and that were tax exempt. They were exempt from all sorts of businesses. So what has happened now? During the last 13 years, 40 different reforms were approved, all of them in favor of providing more exemptions, extending exemption periods, so as to be able to profit from doing one or two or mixing these different exemptions. But in the last 6 months, the government has approved 12 different reforms. 12 reforms that range from banking secrecy laws, the concept of universal income, expending periods, also a mixture of arrangements or regimes. So the law focuses on putting an end to the characteristics, the nature of these exemptions. And it creates a new system that we call RINDE. And RINDE has shortened the periods of exemption. In other words, no longer is the exemption for 20, 30, 40 years. The maximum is 10 for 2 5-year periods each. Plus, this has been offered to what sectors? Honduras is a very agricultural country. Also, we have a lot of forestry. So this proposal has been designed to provide these exemptions, but by benefiting small, medium-sized enterprise, and also agriculture, livestock raising. These are sectors that traditionally have been neglected. So it's hard. It is hard. Something like 20 different economic groups hold these exemptions that represent a high number of lempiras every year. So we have been discussing this issue with them. Also working with academia in the labor sector, working with the campesinos to explain how this excess of benefits leads to a situation where the country cannot even cover its basic budgetary needs. We're certain that the reform bill will be approved by Congress. We're absolutely certain because the documentation, the backing, the context is sufficient. And I think that there are many people in the business sector that are fully mindful of the need to pay taxes. We all have to pay taxes. It's important that we be able to provide support through the tax administration offices. For example, to increase taxes by a factor of 10. So the man on the street, if he buys a snack or stops at the grocery store, there are different sectors that have 100% tax exemption. So we think that this is a very fair bill being debated in Congress. And right now, we are socializing this information in the northern part of the country where there is a strong business sector. And we are certain that in a couple of weeks, the president will be sending this bill to Congress, and we are certain that it will pass. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. We will be following that closely to see how that process goes. Now, I give the floor to Minister Arosemena to talk about the reforms. The question is, what are the necessary reforms? What do we need to think about to implement in terms of fiscal rules and regulations? Are you thinking of some adjustments, especially with this vision of fiscal consolidation of accounts? Care has to be taken to protect public investment so that it doesn't suffer when you have to cut expenses. This is very interesting. It doesn't matter if you're a liberal, if you're a communist, but it is easy to reach an agreement on a fiscal arrangement that will promote entrepreneurship and be fair at the same time. The challenge is more the execution. We economists can reach an agreement, and that's easy to do, but it is when you put it into effect that things become complicated. Now, having said that, in the case of our country, we see that there are some opportunities to improve our tax system, to be able to introduce greater transparency in terms of tax exemptions, tax exceptions, things that make no longer any sense. But also, the idea is to have a tax system that is fair, but that it also encourages entrepreneurship. Now, of course, all this depends on some circumstances and things that are happening in the country, but we do have some proposals that we've been working on and that have to do with taxes, and that's important. Then there are other proposals in areas that have to do with productivity or labor issues, and there we think that that is the key to the lock on the well-being in countries. The minister from Belize was saying that the best social policy is providing jobs, and I agree with what he said. But in the case of Ecuador, if you look at the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum, you can see that out of 190 countries, we're not in the top 5. We're in the bottom 5, and we have great labor rigidity. And this is where you get into the laws passed by Congress and where you get into politics. It's not popular to say that you want to make it easier to hire. That makes common sense, but it gets complicated in politics because there the unions, the pressure groups get involved. Sometimes there are people from the right that are wanting to protect the status quo. They do not want to liberalize the labor relations so that people can reach an agreement. In the case of Ecuador, we have a labor code that dates back to last century. So it's a labor code from another time, and it is not in keeping with today's circumstances. So I think that the reforms in terms of their design, there is technical consensus of what needs to be done in the region, on the planet, or in Ecuador, but it's in politics where things get complicated because navigating all of that becomes more difficult. In any case, we do have some reforms that are ready. Some of them have to be approved by the legislature, others do not. For example, I'm thinking of tariffs, and that is something that can be put in place by the executive. Now, we have some things having to do with capital regulations. We have others that have been prepared, and they will be sent forward at a proper moment, but always with a view to reform, because if we think that by lowering tariffs we increase tax collection, that is not automatic and it's not overnight. And here I would conclude by sharing a story. We in Ecuador have a very special tax. It was created 10 years ago, and it is a tax on the outflow of capital. So that tax was created. It was created 10 years ago, and it's 0.25. Then it was raised to 0.5, then 1, then 2, then 5%. And just to give you an idea, this affects the productive sector by about $1 billion a year. So we want to lower it until we eliminate that tax. Last year, we brought it down from 5 to 4%, and we increased tax collection. So we lowered the tax, we increased the tax collection. This year, we lowered it again. Right now, it's at 375. Then it will come down to 3.5 in December. It will be down further, and in 2021, in the presidential election, the candidate that came in second, the runner-up, in the political platform that was sent to the Electoral Commission, proposed that that tax that we want to lower to zero, he wanted to increase it to 27%, 20%, taxing the outflow of capital. So anything that you buy abroad, of course, you have to provide payment in strong currencies. So there are political trends that don't seem to understand how the taxes wind up being paid by the final user, by the people. And they think that only the rich have to pay these taxes, and we all have to pay them. So having said that, we do have this desire to increase transparency, lower taxes to the extent possible. So our strategy is to lower taxes to increase collection. Now, obviously, that is not overnight. It's not instant. It takes some time, and that has to be offset somehow.
Thank you. I know that we just have a few more minutes. I have one last question. In this world of more expensive financing with higher rates, how are you adjusting your fiscal space for the coming year? Well, obviously, given this situation, we don't have much fiscal space. And given the impact of COVID, all countries, and my country is no exception, have had to deal with fiscal constraint situations. We used up our resources during COVID. The fiscal room we had went to COVID, and then came inflation. And we used our second bullet, if you will. So now we've run out of bullets. And what we at least have been doing is prioritizing our spending. We are aware of the situation. We identify programs that are not priorities. We are postponing some works. For the government, everything is a priority. I don't know of any ministry, no matter how small, that doesn't have an issue with setting priorities. Everything is important. But given that everything matters, we have to see what our top priorities really are. And we've worked on that. We have cut spending in areas we consider not to be priorities: travel, representation, purchasing new vehicles since we came to power 3 years ago, things have changed. To buy a vehicle, you need a special authorization from the office of the president. This is a way to exercise some control. So we are freeing up additional space, resources that we can use to address pressing needs that are emerging as a result of the series of crises. So like good sailors, we need to be able to weather the storm. We need to wait for good weather, for the skies to be clear, so that we can do other things, like fiscal consolidation, like considering other types of reforms, and so on. That is at least how we see it in the Dominican Republic. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I do want to thank all of you for this very open, candid discussion full of very good ideas. The Inter-American Development Bank is here ready to support you and to engage with you. So thank you. Please let's have a round of applause for the ministers who have joined us this afternoon.
Ministra, parémonos para sacar una foto.